WATE 6 on your side starts now.
Coming up on Tennessee This Week, President Donald Trump acquitted in the Senate. And a celebration of the economy in the State of the Union while a top Democrat tears up that speech. Plus, Governor Lee offering pay raises for teachers and more mental health funding for students in his State of the State. That's all coming up on Tennessee This Week. Hello and welcome to Tennessee This Week. I'm Blake Stevens. 134 days later, the impeachment process is over. President Donald Trump was found not guilty by the Senate Wednesday on both articles of impeachment sent by the House in near party line votes. So where do we go from here? What did we learn? What impact will this have in the upcoming primaries in November and in the years to come? So we're bringing in our panel of pundits to sort it all out. Joining us is WATE 6 on your side healthcare analyst Craig Griffith, WATE 6 on your side political contributor Courtney Piper, and GOP Executive Committee member James Corcoran. So this outcome has been guessed at for weeks. We've been talking about it here for feels like months. No surprises here. So my question, did anyone win? Did anyone lose? We'll start with you, James.
Well, I think the American people have lost in that at the end of the day, as a result, our leaders haven't been doing the business of the American people. We all knew what the outcome was going to be before we started, and at the end of the day, nothing happened. I think at the end of the day, probably a lot of people might have lost a little bit of faith in the political process. I mean, when you look at, we had multiple senators who are currently running for president who decided to cast a vote against their potential rival, even though that they had an interest in the outcome. So at the end of the day, I think not a whole lot's really changed if you look at the basic polls. I think Trump's still supported strongly by the Republican Party, and the Democrats still dislike him.
But on that support, that level of support, do you see that as a win in any way, this impeachment process as a win for the president?
Well, if you think about what would have happened if he had actually been impeached and removed from office, the Republicans would have been in a position of not having a duly elected candidate, because based on the timing of it, we probably couldn't have had time to run an actual full Republican primary. So it's really disturbing to think that what could have happened is half of the voters of this country could have lost their opportunity to pick their choice for president. And as a result, I think a lot of people are going to be angry, and I think a lot of people are going to show up that are Republicans and conservatives in November as a result of this.
Maybe garner that base a little.
Yeah, well, I think that the Republican base has been ginned up now by the whole impeachment process. If you looked at the polls previous, earlier in late last year, the Democrats had the enthusiasm bonus. Their base was much more enthusiastic. But if you look at the polling now, the strongly support Trump part of the poll is really moving up. And I think that the impeachment process energized that Republican base of his that he had. So I think that in that sense. But on the other hand, the Gallup poll that was mentioned where Trump was 49% of favorable rating, well, the unfavorable is 50%. So we are a country that is very split, almost split right down the middle. The 49% enjoy, 50% don't. So it's going to be a long, drawn-out primary season into the general election.
So in some ways you see it as a win, maybe in terms of garnering the base, but do you see it as a loss in any way for them?
Well, as James said, the American people lost. It was basically 3 months of not, you couldn't, by the Constitution, do any other work in the Senate when the impeachment process was going on. So, they shut down, in essence, other than doing the impeachment work. So, yes, I mean, we still have incredibly sky-high prescription prices. We still don't have an infrastructure program. So there's these issues that they could be working on that they weren't working on.
Courtney?
You need more than your base to win an election, and Donald Trump has done nothing to expand his base, and this entire impeachment process has done nothing to expand his base. Furthermore, the business of the American people is holding the executive branch of government accountable, and that's what the House did, and that's what the Senate attempted to do. What we saw as the Senate trial started to go on and on and on is Republicans changing their tune from, he didn't withhold aid from Ukraine, he didn't do any of these things, to, well, it looks like he did it. He did it, and it was improper, and it's worth a censure, but I don't think it's impeachable. So clearly he did these things that he was accused of, and we saw Republicans really take the easy way out, with the exception of Mitt Romney, by qualifying their votes for their not guilty votes by saying, well, yeah, he did it, it was improper, but I don't know if we should impeach him. We've got an election. They pulled a Mitch McConnell. We've got an election coming up. Let the people decide.
So do you
Well,
think
he had a big enough base to win. He had a big enough base to become president. So, you know, the Karl Rove model is that you're supposed to expand your base while you're in office.
And he hasn't
you know,
done
and that's
that.
what, you know, Bush did, and that's what Obama did. And he hasn't done that. But on the other hand, we are such a splintered country that I don't know that old conventional wisdom is still intact.
But you see a lot of swing states that he won, which catapulted him into victory, like the Rust Belt states, that have since elected Democratic senators or governors. So we might see the tide changing in those Rust Belt states.
Just after we taped last week's show, Senator Lamar Alexander announced he would not press to have more evidence or witnesses in that trial, dashing Democrats' hopes of continuing the process. Alexander saying, quote, "I worked with other senators to make sure that we have the right to ask for more documents and witnesses, but there is no need for more evidence to prove something that has already been proven and that does not meet the United States Constitution's high bar for an impeachable offense. The Constitution does not give the Senate the power to remove the president from office and ban him from this year's ballot simply for actions that are inappropriate." What do you all make of Alexander's decision and the reasons he gave for it?
Well, you know, Lamar tried to have it both ways on this one. Yeah, you know, yes, he did it, but no, I don't want to see any more witnesses to prove that he did. So clearly, they're looking at Romney in this state, in the Senate. He was the person that stood up and had the courage of his convictions. If Lamar thought he was guilty and did what he did, his phrasing it as it didn't reach the bar for impeachment is pretty weak when you compare it to what Romney had to say about, you know, fulfilling his oath.
We're going to get to Romney here in just a second. Courtney, what do you make of Alexander's statement?
It's really a quandary because through Senator Alexander's entire tenure as a public servant, he's always been able to have that strength of his personal convictions, and here was an opportunity for him to show that. And like Craig said, he was able to have it both ways, which is very interesting for a man that doesn't have anything to lose. He is not running for re-election. My only suspicion is that he, like other Republicans, are afraid of Donald Trump. The senator thought he needed to get more business done before he was out of office and needed Donald Trump in order to do that. So he kind of split the difference and took this middle road.
James?
He's not running for re-election. He has no reason to be afraid of Donald Trump. He did what he believed to be right. And at the end of the day, his point is, this is something that people only care about on a partisan basis. And the best proof of that is Biden is accused of doing something very similar with aid previously. And you don't see any Democrats sitting there marching and asking for Biden's head for having withheld aid to make a change in Ukraine's government. So at the end of the day, people care about this based on a partisan basis, and that is not what our framers had in mind when they set the bar for impeachment at being 2/3 of the Senate.
But that's a little misleading, James, because President Trump himself, instead of taking his concerns to the FBI, the Department of Justice, he took it upon himself and his little band of henchmen.
The FBI can investigate things that are happening in Ukraine. They don't have jurisdiction there.
But the president doesn't need to. If the president thinks somebody who is running for office or held a position abused their power while in office, he has policy and procedures to get that investigated. He himself personally does not need to get involved and ask the Ukraine to investigate a political rival while he is running for office.
Ukraine is in the best position to investigate things that happen in Ukraine.
Now, in the end, you know, I think in using what Lamar has said, that he was guilty of what he was accused of doing, what he wanted was dirt on Joe Biden, who was at that point in time the highest ranked opponent that he was going to have in the upcoming presidential race. And he wanted dirt on Biden. And I'm not sure that the impeachment process hasn't ruined Biden's campaign now. They, for months, took him through the ringer. He and his family raked him through the coals. And I think it really has hurt his viability as a candidate, which, if there is any finding to come out of Iowa, which I'm not so sure there is in that debacle, you know, he came in fourth.
All right, I want to go back to a topic you brought up a second ago. Senator and former GOP presidential candidate Mitt Romney was the only member of the Senate to break party ranks. He voted guilty on one of the two articles of impeachment, abuse of power. Romney explaining his vote, saying, quote, "The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. In Romney's words, yes, he did. President Trump's son, Don Jr., suggesting Romney should be kicked out of the Republican Party. So does this lack of a straight party line vote, does it matter? And what does Romney get out of crossing that line, and what does he risk? Courtney, I'll start with you on that.
He gets a lot more publicity and visibility in terms of he himself as a public servant, as a U.S. Senator. He gets more of the limelight. It also could mean that he could be one of these senators that starts reaching across the aisle to get more done with Democrats. We saw a lot of other senators, both from Maine and Alaska in the Republican Party, that again, like Senator Alexander, kind of wanted to split the difference in how they were going to cast their votes or explain their votes. So he could be somebody that really starts to reach across the aisle and get stuff done. There aren't that many Republicans' minds that need to be sort of changed to start working together and start to legislate for the Senate to start doing more business.
Hey, do you remember the score in Super Bowl last week? Or do you remember that Kansas City won? You know, I think the score in the vote is not going to be remembered in history as something that's you know, significant. But Romney will face headwinds. There's no question about it. Trump is, I think, always his reputation is to pile on an opposition, and I think that he'll pile on Romney as much as he can. You know, he needs help. You know, he needs those people to pass whatever legislation he brings up to the Senate. So, you know, there's only a limit that he can try to crush Romney in this case.
Well, and it also might completely distract Donald Trump from actually running his campaign for president if he's so hyper-focused on obliterating a now political rival.
Could be a distraction. James?
I don't think Donald Trump being angry at one individual is going to distract him from running a campaign. During the 2016 campaign, he was able to have multiple enemies and quite frankly, he probably gained more from his personal attacks than a lot of his opponents. So at the end of the day, I don't see that pulling any steam out of him.
I don't see Romney caring if, you know, Trump tweets about him. And that's what everyone in Washington seems to be so afraid of these days, is a negative Donald Trump tweet.
Well, I know I don't want one.
Yeah,
all right, we've got to go to break. Still to come, status reports on the state of Tennessee and the State of the Union. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE, 6 on your side.
Increase your home's livable space with a Champion sunroom custom built to fit your home. Right now, Champion sunrooms are 20% off.
The sunroom has now become our family room, and we live in our sunroom.
Champion sunrooms are made to fit your lifestyle and are backed by our exclusive warranty.
The number of custom options for our sunroom were endless.
Save 20% on a new sunroom your family can enjoy all year long. Book your free in-home consultation online or call 888-930-CHAMPION today.
Hello, I'm Mike Hatmaker. It's a new year with new deals, and check these out. Jeep Wrangler Unlimited discounted $6,000, and you get $1,000 worth of gift cards. 2019 Chevy Silverado, sale price $23,888. 2014 Ford Fusion SE, beautiful interior, sale price $10,888, and you get $1,000 worth of gift cards. 2015 Jeep Wrangler, $24,888. You get $1,000 worth of gift cards. So hurry on in to Jim Claw Dodge Chrysler Jeep Ram.
Every day, we're out here telling your stories.
Everybody has an ability to achieve something great.
Local stories about life, community, the Tennessee spirit, and the rhythm behind what makes this such an amazing place to call home.
Amazing things come from amazing people.
We're on your side, here to help by focusing on the needs and concerns of East Tennessee. We've been a part of your community for more than 65 years.
For everyone and for everything East Tennessee. Thanks for watching WATE, 6 on your side.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Tennessee This Week. We're continuing the conversation now with Craig Griffith, Courtney Piper, and James Corcoran. Monday, Governor Bill Lee delivered his second State of the State address. Our state capitol newsroom reporter Chris Bungard was there as Governor Lee offered up his budget priorities. Here it is.
Lawmakers here said there would be an accent on education spending. How much was the question? In a Tennessee state budget that shot past the $40 billion mark for the first time, Republican Governor Bill Lee highlighted in his State of the State address a potential 4% raise for K-12 teachers, and there was more.
Over the next 2 years, we'll recommend moving minimum salary schedule for teachers from $36,000 to $40,000 so that no Tennessee teacher is making less than $40,000 a year.
There was further action on education as the governor proposed $70 million to help with early literacy, and then a $250 million trust fund to help in school mental health issues.
Scores of teachers and principals, as well as our education commissioner, have pleaded for reinforcements from the state to help schools tackle the mental health and other challenges that students bring with them to the classroom.
Tucked into the overall spending plan that reflects a 3.7% increase over last year's state budget is some potential help worth $100 million for local and county governments to use for things like roads or public safety. Other budget investment numbers include money to hire 25 new Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents and a second year of pay increases for correction officers as the department struggles to fill staff shortages pointed out in a recent state audit. Now begins the long process for state lawmakers to either add or subtract from this nearly $41 billion budget. Reporting from the state capitol, Chris Bungard.
And hey, the governor is also highlighting a tax cut affecting potentially 191,000 Tennesseans. He proposes cutting in half the state's $400 yearly professional privilege tax. That affects professionals like doctors, lawyers, and accountants. So my question to the panel here, what do you all think of the governor's slate of proposals? Craig, we'll start with you.
Well, I think that he had a long laundry list and gave, part of the pie to many needy groups in the state. I think probably one of the main things that I didn't see in it is that he did enhance some Medicaid spending for giving postpartum care to women delivering babies on Medicare to a year, and some dental issues, but he didn't really attack the problem of the uninsured in the state. So I think that is lacking in there. And then also, sort of his focus on education was, you have to salute everything that he's did, but you have to wonder, was he making up for the problems that he caused the people who work in schools in the state of Tennessee last year by working so hard on the voucher program and getting that passed? So you wonder if there was a balancing act there to sweeten the pot for the public education, while he's still giving, it's going to be about $19 million of state fund to the voucher program, and also about $20 million for charter school facility improvement. So you have those going to private school entities.
Wow. Gotcha. James, what did you make of it?
Well, I agree with what Craig said. Obviously, I think the public teachers unions are probably going to be coming out very strongly after the voucher vote. So I think, sweetening the pot a little bit might pull some of the sting out. It's hard to be really angry when you've got a really huge raise coming to you individually. That being said, it's still a couple of years before he faces re-election, so will people remember that, a couple of years down the line when the governor's actually at race? It's sort of surprising to see this much increase in spending when we've got a Republican supermajority and a Republican in the executive office. So and we've got some historic figures in terms of how much money we've got in reserve. Seeing a little bit more in the way of tax cuts would probably be something that I think a lot more of the Republican base would probably like to see, but once the government's got a certain amount of money, it's really hard to convince that many people to give it up.
So you're okay with that amount of spending, the increase?
Personally, I'd rather see the spending stay the same or go down, but at the end of the day, I think he's making a lot of the right people happy, so he's reaching in the middle.
Courtney, making a lot of the right people happy?
The governor's State of the State address had a lot of, and his budget has a lot of really good issues that he's trying to tackle, and there was a lot of really good content in there. Just as a philosophy, I just don't understand the need to cut taxes when the needs of the state of Tennessee are growing. Our population bases are growing. We have more needs in terms of health care and infrastructure and education as a state. So the practice of cutting taxes while our needs are so great, clearly demonstrated by the fact that budget spending has gone up, is a bit of a head scratcher for me. There's also some questionable things that he talked about with education that I'd really like to learn more about. He mentioned this 4% raise or going from $36,000 to $40,000, but in terms of that 4% raise across the board for teachers, it's not entirely up to Governor Lee in this budget. We've got this very complex system, the BEP formula, for how we decide who gets how much money from the state of Tennessee per county. So by the time it gets to a county level, teachers could actually see less or they could see more. So perhaps that's something that we need to look at as it relates to teacher pay, so that's more equitably distributed.
So you think we need to look at the BEP formula as a whole?
Look at the BEP, and there's also things that the governor's doing in terms of that trust fund. He's not putting $250 million into mental health at K through 12. He's putting that into a trust fund, and then we'll draw interest off of it.
All right, one more topic I want to bring up, a Medicaid expansion bill that would deliver health care to potentially hundreds of thousands of Tennesseans, raising a lot of eyebrows. And that's because one of the sponsors is a rural Republican whose state party has staunchly resisted efforts to expand state's Medicaid system known as TennCare. The measure came on the last day that new bills could be filed. Representative Ron Travis's bill includes spending safeguards if funding falls off and work requirements and a copay. Could this be this year's Medicaid expansion, or could this be the year that Medicaid expansion happens? And I want to start with our GOP committee member there. Is this the year?
I don't think that there's any chance of anyone being more likely to vote for it than in the last several years. I would probably expect this to die before it gets even to the committee. Now, a local member of our delegation, Senator Briggs, I think he's been a champion of this issue, and I don't think it was surprising to see that he was supporting it again. I mean, he's got the strongest opposition in terms of recent races and from the left, so I don't think it's a surprise to see him. I mean, he's been consistent. But that being said, I don't think the party, from a statewide perspective, has grown any more likely to support Medicare expansion.
Courtney?
This happened because Republicans are now starting to see what a dire state we are in Tennessee as it relates to health care. There are 280,000 Tennesseans that are suffering because we have not expanded Medicaid. And this bill will get it done, and it will get it done quickly and in the right way and in a proven way. I was very, very proud to see Senator Briggs, who's our one of our Knox County senators, co-sponsoring this legislation. I think it will give it a really good chance, and I hope people give it a second look.
He's supported it before, though. Do you see it as at all possible that this is the year it could happen?
I do, because we have Republicans who, as James has pointed out, despite the propaganda from our state Republican Party, are saying, look, things are broken in my county. We've got people suffering. I have constituents who are suffering. Hospitals are closing. We need to do something.
I think it's an exaggeration to call it a dire strait. Our uninsured rate is still lower than the national average. So while we've got a lot of people
uninsured, but it depends on what population you're looking at.
Correct.
Lower income people, who have high-paying jobs and with insurance. It depends.
I'm so sorry to do this to you. We've got about 10 seconds, Craig.
Well, I agree with Courtney that you're seeing the problems in the rural areas coming up, and that's why you're getting this bill from a rural legislature. Still, I don't think it gets anywhere close to with the Republican supermajority in Nashville changing their mind.
All right, Craig, sorry again to give you that time crunch. We'll be right back.
If you dream it, we can create it. Knoxville's lifestyle store is Brown Squirrel Furniture. Come experience the Farmhouse Gallery, modern day, vintage industrial, the Amish barn full of solid wood bedrooms and dining rooms, mountain retreat, and more. Get this 3-piece top-grade leather reclining sofa, love seat, and recliner, just $12.95. Or this 7-piece dining collection, just $7.95. And during our President's Day sale, get 0% financing for 5 years. It's Brown Squirrel Furniture's President's Day sale.
WATE 6 on your side, honoring Black history with this moment in Hidden History.
It is not just a Black story or an African-American story. It's an American story. 400 years ago, slaves arrived at Point Comfort, today known as Fort Monroe, and throughout the year, there will be programs and ceremonies to celebrate the history.
This moment in Hidden History is brought to you by D1 Athletic Training.
Toyota has elevated the expectations of what an SUV can be, and the experts have taken notice. Introducing the all-new Highlander, aggressively styled with a powerful V6 inside an all-new premium interior, more cargo space, available 12.3-inch touchscreen, and connectivity for all your devices. With Toyota's most advanced safety features as standard equipment. Now, when you finance a new Highlander, you'll get $750 APR cash from Toyota Financial Services. Go better. Go Highlander. Toyota. Let's go places.
All right, welcome back. President Donald Trump touting his accomplishments, especially on the economy in his State of the Union address this week. The president calling it the great American comeback, with jobs booming, income soaring, poverty plummeting, and crime falling. Also Monday night, you couldn't miss the tension there in that room. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi leaving out part of the typical introductory phrasing about the high honor and distinct privilege to introduce the president, while President Trump not shaking her hand. And then after he finished his speech, Speaker Pelosi ripped up her copy. So who played the night correctly? Is the vision of America the president put on display enough to put him in good standing with the voters and maybe earn him another 4 years in office? I don't know who has not had a chance to start first here, but James, I want to start with you on that question.
Well, I think, again, the American people were the loser at the end of this, because when we see people who are elected to lead our country and represent our country acting like children, I think it's, at the end of the day, embarrassing. I was kind of reminded of the old Mike Judge movie, Idiocracy, when Nancy Pelosi started tearing it up. I feel like we're about an inch away from changing it to the House of Representing, and I can't help but wonder how many times Pelosi might have practiced tearing that speech up. When you tear up a speech that was talking about how great the American people are doing, I think it sends, at the very least, a mixed message, because at the end of the day, our economy is doing great, America is moving forward, and then to not at least acknowledge that fact and at least take some pride in the fact that America is doing better as a country over petty disagreements between the individuals. It's embarrassing.
That's incredibly hypocritical. I mean, have you seen any of President Donald Trump's tweets lately? Are you not going to hold him to the same standard as you're going to hold the Speaker of the House?
Well, I'm sure you can do it for me.
You reap what you sow.
We don't have a standard of decency anymore.
Right.
And for crying out loud, it was a piece of paper. She didn't mock a disabled reporter. She didn't talk about grabbing a man by his genitalia. It was a piece of paper she ripped up to show that she was not on board with the delusion that he presented.
So we've got the same standards of conduct on Twitter as we do actually in the House?
Well, I mean, the things that you say represent who you are as a person, yes.
I don't think that Trump acknowledged, that, he's the most outstanding person. As we said earlier, he, tends to crush anybody who's an opponent. So I think, again, you reap what you sow. The political discourse in our country is in the gutter now. Well, and I think that's just an example of where it is.
On that optimistic note, I do want to remind our viewers we do have an election coming up, and not just the presidential primary. Early voting starts Wednesday. Here in Knox County, we've got races on the ballot, including county commission, school board, public defender, and a lot more. So get out there and vote. That's our time. We hope you'll join us next Sunday at 12:30 for more Tennessee This Week.
The views of guests on Tennessee This Week are their own and do not represent the views of WATE 6 on your side or